And let me introduce, it's my proud privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, about the speaker. So turn to page 4, not the e-flyer as the Vice Chancellor said. Okay, we have a real brochure. Okay, so Dr. Subir Dhar teaches theory, English and New English literature at Rabindra Bharati University. He is a critic and translator and as a recipient of the Charles Wallace Trust Grant. He has pursued research beyond his PhD work at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, the Tate Gallery, UK, and the University of Denver, USA. His publications include Burning Bright, William Blake, and the Poetry of Imagination, and Describing Semiotics, Literature Culture Studies. And the edited volumes Romancing the Strange, The Fiction of Kunal Basu, Rabindra Tagore, New Languages in 10 Languages, and Colonial and Post-Colonial Shakespeare. He is currently working on a volume of Tagore translations and on a projected book on locational hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is something that he's going to talk about. So without further ado, so let me invite Professor Subir Dhar to the stage. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, senior faculty members of ULAB, ladies and gentlemen, scholars young and as senior as me. I want to start speaking from my heart because this is my first visit to Bangladesh and Dhaka, and I have to say that in the last few hours I've had a lot of experience, a good experience of your warmth and hospitality, from the food to the conversation, particularly with Professor Asfar Hussain last evening really, in a notorious traffic jam in Dhaka. We discovered that we had a wonderful, lot of areas in common in shared interest in literature and aspects of literature. So, may I start by thanking all of you here, and particularly the organizers, for giving me this opportunity of standing here before you and to give the keynote address. What I want to really do is not talk something very serious. There will be serious issues, of course, that we're going to address in this conference today and tomorrow. So I see myself as a kind of an introducer, a kind of an initiator of proceedings. So I'll touch upon some issues that may come up in the deliberations over the next 2 days, today and tomorrow. And I want to also give a kind of a frame, if you want, a frame in which we can locate magic and literature. I want to start out by saying, as Professor Shamshad was saying, that magic is all around us. And even today, you see in the 21st century, when there's technological magic literally at our fingertips. You press a few buttons, you talk to anyone in the world, you press a few buttons or you click a few sites, places, and you get access to all the information in the world. Even today, you see magic is something central to our imagination, our feelings, our emotions, and even our day-to-day activities. You see, every time we talk about fate, every time we talk about Kismet, every time we talk about Kopal or Bhaggo or what have you, we're really talking about magic, aren't we? So you see, magic in this very postmodern age is something which is absolutely integrated with our personalities, with our beliefs, with our theories, with our emotions, everything. These are, of course, commonplaces. But what I really want to go on to is the notion that you see, whether this belief in magic is something which resides in our archetypal inheritances, going back to our prehistoric past, or whether we can say that these are manifestations, psychologists say that these are manifestations of our desire, our wish fulfillments, as it were. Whatever it is, we can certainly say that, all the non-positivistic, mystical and poetic elements in our notions of forces, causation, effect, and substance may be traced back to the old habits of mind in which magic was born and which the human mind is slow to throw off. Yet, I think it's important to note that even though belief in magic goes back to the dawn of civilization, systematic efforts to theorize the concept and the phenomenon of magic appears to go back a little over a century or so. Of course, this is not to say that writings on the subject of magic did not exist prior to the modern age. In the medieval and the early modern period in Europe in particular, both practicing magicians and more skeptical thinkers indulged in the production of a wide variety of discourses on the topic of magic. For example, Thorndike writes in his History of Magic, which was published in 1941, books of secrets and experiments were prominent in medieval manuscripts and were to flare forth again in the second half of the century. That was a quotation. Even the best educated men of the century, for example, Melanchthon, also practiced astrology. And the nominalist Planche, himself a born fighter against witch hunts, accepted the magical worldview of his time in principle. The works of theologians and philosophers, as well as that of experimental scientists, including, interestingly enough, Isaac Newton, were marked by magical patterns of thinking. Many, like England's King James at that time, were prone to believe in the demonological aspect of the magical arts, even though a few, like Reginald Scott, tended to dismiss all claims to the possession of supernatural abilities as, and I quote, the knavery of conjurers, the impiety of enchanters, the folly of soothsayers, the impudent falsehood of cozeners, the curiosities of figure casters, the beggarly art of alchemistry, and all the conveyances of legerdemain. Unquote. Now, you see, my intention in looking upon attitudes to magic in England in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is because it was in these periods of history that written literature in the West began to first embody magical acts in a significant way. The first text in English literature that I would like to draw your attention to is Chaucer's The Franklin's Tale, which is the type, as you all know, of the Breton lay. No student of English here will need to be reminded that in the story, a young, handsome, wise, and rich young man, obviously an irresistible kind of a person, who's called Aurelius, falls in love with a beautiful but married woman who's called Dorigen. And Dorigen's husband, as you know, is far away from her. And so she's currently alone. And when Aurelius falls in love with her, he naturally importunes her over and over again to submit to him. But Dorigen is reluctant. She is, after all, an honorable woman, and so she keeps on turning him down. And then, when the importunities get too much, then Dorigen says that she is willing to return his love if only he can do something very strange, and that is if he can make some black rocks, they are black and ugly rocks, off the sea coast, and what Aurelius has to do is to make them vanish, make them disappear. Now this of course is an impossibility. And initially for about a couple of years, Aurelius is in a fix about what to do, and then he has a brother who tells him that there's a young man that he knows who's a clerk, a very learned person, in fact a bachelor of law, and this person dabbles in the magical arts. And so they immediately, both of them go off to Orleans, they meet this man, and this man tells them that yes, he would be able to produce the illusion of the rocks having vanished, but only if Aurelius promises to pay him a sum of 1,000 pounds. Back in those days, 1,000 pounds is sheer, astronomical, if not phenomenal. And so you see, this is the agreement that they come to. And then we are also given, this is interesting, you see, the Franklin's Tale is interesting because we are given a lot of descriptions of magical arts. That is, not only generalized, descriptions of what is going on, but very specific connotations of the magic effects particularly. Like what? For example, the magician tells us that he can conjure up a large body of water inside a hall and have a barge row up and down. He could also conjure up a grim lion, make flowers spring up as in a meadow, produce wine and white and red grapes, and even create, and I quote from Chaucer, a castle of lime and stone, which means a castle all of lime and stone, and voided it anon. That is, he made it vanish whenever he wanted to. But these are not the only descriptions of magical effects that Chaucer provides. For the learned clerk puts on a very private magic show for Aurelius and his brother in his study, which is, the center of the magic arts, because magic is, of course, something very learned. I mean, you didn't inherit magic in one school of thought in the Middle Ages, you have to learn magic. And there it is said that he brings up visions of parks full of wild deer being hunted by hounds and men, of falconers in pursuit of herons, of knights jousting in a plain, and a show of Aurelius's lady in a dance in which Aurelius himself appears to be dancing. The special powers of the magician are also emphasized early in the same sequence, as the clerk is said to have telepathically revealed to Aurelius and his brother not only the cause of their coming, but also all that was in their intention, quote unquote. In other words, you see, this is a very graphic description of real magic in the Middle Ages, or rather one could say Chaucer's idea of real magic, which is of course a very general populist notion of real magic in the Middle Ages. These descriptions of magic effects give us not only an insight into medieval imaginings of magic tricks, but also reveal certain functions of Chaucer's use of magic. We notice here, for example, that magic is being used as a device to propel the plot of the tale. For without the magical event of the rocks disappearing, the lady, Dorigen, would not have been caught in the moral dilemma she subsequently faces. A more general point is made, and that is that the magician is a learned individual, well versed in astrology, and a rich man in possession of a well-appointed house. Finally, there is the idea that the performances of magic have a strong economic motivation behind them. And this is something which is very interestingly something that Malinowski reflects on in his book on magic. And this is what Malinowski has to say. He says, sorcery in all its major forms is usually specialized and institutionalized. That is, the sorcerer is a professional whose services can be bought. In all cases, sorcery is either in the same hands as political power, prestige or wealth, or else it can be purchased as demanded by those who can afford to do so. Now, you see, this economic motivation of sorcery is something which is fundamental not only to Chaucer's time, but also to ours. And I'm sure we would have papers on this or presentations on this in the next 2 days. But if Chaucer and the Franklin's magician is a prosperous professional, 2 centuries later, Shakespeare and Ben Jonson were to limn very different magical personalities. Interest and belief in magic was, however, still strong enough for many of the era's most successful playwrights to feature magic in their plot lines. In Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay by Robert Greene, the magician Friar Bacon displays a range of magical skills. He shows Prince Edward the romance of his friend Lacy with Margaret, the fair maid of Fressingfield, whom he, that is Prince Edward, had hoped to seduce in his magic glass. Now the magic glass is something again which is very interesting. A magic glass could be in various forms and shapes. If you think of Macbeth and the witches, there the magic glass is the bubbling liquid in the magic cauldron, into which Macbeth looks and sees the visions of the kings of the future, including, as you all know, Banquo's descendants. He also, that is Friar Bacon, he also magically transports a tavern hostess from one place to another and wins in a contest of magic with a German magician before an audience of kings. In collaboration with another magician, Friar Bungay, Bacon labors towards his greatest achievement, the creation of an artificial head made of brass, animated by demonic spirits, that can surround England with a protective wall of the same metal. And this detail is also found in Dr. Foster's, because Marlowe says that one of the intentions of Dr. Foster's in using magic is to encircle Germany with a wall of brass. So once again, essentially magic used for a nationalist purpose, which is a rather interesting thought, I thought. In Marlowe's play, however, the magic is clearly demonical. Despite any undertone of admiration for his Promethean hero, Marlowe's attitude to magic is that it is an inverted form of religion. Faustus's invocation of Mephistopheles is an action contrary to the ritual of prayer and worship. This is quite in keeping with Fraser's theorization of magic that, and I quote, "A magical rite normally acts on its own, that is, it constrains, while a religious rite worships and conciliates. The former has an automatic immediate reaction, the latter, the religious act, indirectly through a kind of respectful persuasion. Here, the agent is a spiritual intermediary," unquote. Indeed, it seems clear that to Marlowe's mind, magic was distinctly different from religion in that religion creates values and attains ends indirectly, whereas magic consists of acts which have a practical utilitarian value and are effective only as a means to an end. In other works of literature written in the same period, we have quite different representations of magic. Ben Jonson's magician Subtle in The Alchemist is a low charlatan masquerading as an alchemist. Yet, the play touches upon issues that go far more deep than illustrating a simple case of fraud. Maurice Morse, in his general theory of magic, has pointed out that, and I quote, "Magic as a whole is an object a priori of belief, a belief which is unanimous and collective," unquote. Belief, Morse adds, implies the adherence of all men to an idea and consequently to a state of feeling, an act of will, and at the same time a phenomena of ideation, unquote. A collective belief in magic brings us face to face with a unanimous sentiment and a unanimous will found in the community. It is the limits of this unanimity of belief that Ben Jonson inspects in The Alchemist, questioning as he does the gullibility of worthy Englishmen like Sir Epicure Mammon, who desire to use magic as a means superior to his own limited human powers to help him capture good fortune in the shape of the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone. In a somewhat similar way, the context of belief and unbelief in magic is played out in Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1, in which Mortimer lauds the magician Owen Glendower as, and this is what Mortimer says, exceedingly well read and profited in strange concealments. Even as the most skeptical Hotspur reacts to Glendower's claim to have power over the devil by saying, quote, "And I can teach thee to shame the devil by telling the truth. Tell truth and shame the devil," unquote. In his Macbeth, however, Shakespeare uses magic in a far more creative and complex way. The magic of the witches in Macbeth do far more than instigate the Thane of Clodagh and Glamis to murder Duncan. The witches themselves define a category beyond gender and social class, being women with beards and denizens of such markedly unsocial spaces as caves, forests, and blasted heaths or wastelands. It is interesting to note that this very marginality accords or endows them with power, at least in the estimation of such social beings as Macbeth and Banquo. The magical skills that the witches and their superior Hecate possess are those that are commonly believed to be the abilities of magicians during the time. What are these? Number one, the power to vanish at will. Number two, to control sea winds. Number three, perform acts of telepathy and precognition. And finally, having the skill at the raising of images and apparitions. There is a strong hint, however, in Banquo's initial tepidity of interest in the witch's prophecy, that Shakespeare was aware that the values attributed to magic are resultants of public opinions of belief and not valid empirical facts that exist and have a validity beyond the realm of doxa. But this is not all. For the magic in Macbeth fits in with and relates to a more fundamental aspect of Shakespeare's vision in this play. It is noticeable that the witches perform not in public spaces or in shrines or temples in broad daylight, but only in atmosphere foul and fair, in the obscurity of mist and fog, and in secret occult places located far away from human habitation and, significantly enough, usually at night. Magic in Macbeth, therefore, is an enactment in reverse of the basic social principles and rights of faith and allegiance, loyalty and gratitude, society and civilization. Seen from this perspective, it becomes clear that the magic in Macbeth is far more than an external spectacle or show, and much more than a prop or a spur to dramatic action. From his first encounter with the witches, magic and its perverse inverted values actually enter into the psyche of Macbeth and change him for the worse, from honourable kinsman to the dead butcher of Scotland. At the end of the play, Macbeth and his wife gain a social status similar to that of the witches, that of abnormality. Now, there are two things which I like to concentrate here on. The first is, notice, this inversion business is very interesting. I wrote a paper once on Macbeth in which I argued that it was very significant that Shakespeare has so many plays with kings in it, isn't it? King Richard III, King Henry IV, King Henry V, and so and so. But very significantly, Macbeth is not called King Macbeth, it's only Macbeth. Why? One reason can be that Macbeth is a king, but only in name. You see, the whole fact is, Macbeth really enacts a kind of a parody of kingship. I mean, this is the point that I take from Kantorowicz. Kantorowicz talks about two rituals which are mirror opposites of each other. The first is the ritual of coronation, where you see the king sets out from his palace on an open chariot or an open car. People throng the streets, line the both sides of the streets, they cheer him on. Then he goes to the cathedral, he enters, he climbs up the steps of the cathedral, and there's the platform and the altar, and the priest anoints him, and finally the crown is placed on his head. That is one ritual. Contrary to that, Kantorowicz talks about the execution of a condemned prisoner. Here once again you see what Kantorowicz says is very significant. He says that the prisoner is taken out of prison, he's put on an open cart, the cart is taken through the open streets, and people insult him, spit on him, they humiliate him, and then he's taken to the gallows. Once again, he has to, climb up the stairs to the gallows. There's a priest in attendance, and finally, he is executed. So you see, these are inversions. Now, I thought that this is very interesting about Macbeth also. Because what Macbeth does is literally a kind of an inversion of the principles of kingship. A king should be thinking only of his subjects. Macbeth doesn't. A king should be able to demand and get the allegiance and the loyalty of the people under him. Macbeth doesn't. In other words, you see, Macbeth is actually a parody of a king. And what I want to say here at this point is that the witches are also like that. And the interesting thing about the witches, as I said already, that is, you see, they are most powerful when they are most powerless. Because you see, they are marginal, aren't they? And as marginal individuals, it is their marginality which gives them so much power. People are scared of them. And, being scared, of course, is an index of how much power you have. And they're scared of them. Why? Because they are not ordinary, they are unusual. And this fits in with, the Renaissance magic picture as well. Partly because, if you think of it, who were the magicians at that time? There were two kinds really. The first was, of course, the superior magicians, like say John Dee. John Dee was the court magician and astrologer of Queen Elizabeth. In fact, it is said that it was he who decided the date and the time of her coronation by looking at her astrological charts. And John Dee, you see, is also supposed to have conjured up a storm which scattered the Spanish Armada. In other words, you see, John Dee is the prototypical hero behind Shakespeare's Tempest. So that was one kind of person, and John Dee was very famous, you see. In the rest of the Europe, he was called Johannes Dee, and Johannes Dee would perform before kings. He was fabulously rich and so and so. On the other hand, on the streets of London, you didn't get that. You got very ordinary people, the so-called masterless men. And these masterless men were poor people, you see, economically deprived, people without a profession. They were tricksters, if you want, confidence tricksters, pickpockets, etc. In fact, there's a marvelous picture, a Renaissance picture really, 16th century, which shows that a magician is doing magic on the street. Okay? And a magician's got an assistant who's busy picking the pockets of the people who are watching the magic. Now, once again, you see, there's an economic motivation there as well, but again, there's a kind of a class distinction. The distinction between the haves and the have-nots, and how you see the have-nots are exploiting one section of the haves. Anyway, we'll come to that later, and I'm sure there will be talk on this or discussions on this. And of course, if I guessed correctly, this is something which is very significant and central to Professor Aspar's presentation, plenary tomorrow. Anyway, two more. So this is what Macbeth is doing with witchcraft and magic. On the other hand, if you go to a different play and a different point of view, Shakespeare's only play with a magician as the protagonist is, of course, The Tempest. If the witches in Macbeth represent black magic, Prosperous is carefully endowed with his creator with the less appalling hues of white magic. It is made clear in the play that Prospero's magic is art, that is, the result of a knowledge derived from close and arduous study, not only of the alliance with the devil, but rather from books. Books became very central. Unlike Prospero's evil powers, unlike Sycorax's evil powers, with which she had confined Ariel to a cloven pine, Prospero's magic is beneficial in that he had freed Ariel. Of course, one has to mention that it is another matter, of course, altogether, that Prospero uses the same magical powers to command Ariel and to control, enslave and dominate over Caliban as a sort of a colonial master. There can be little doubt also that in portraying Prospero, Shakespeare drew upon a number of strong folk beliefs. There were myths in his own time of the extraordinary powers of John Dee, who I talked about, the royal astrologer and magician in the court of Queen Elizabeth. And there was another story about Francis Drake that upon hearing of the approach of the Spanish fleet, he had called for a block of wood which he had proceeded to chop into pieces. And each of the pieces of wood had been magically transformed into fire ships that set the Spanish men of war on fire. Prospero, in other words, is cast in the figure of a popular hero in the folk imagination, largely because of the picturesque interest which magic automatically excites. What appeals most to the imagination in magic is the ease with which the magician achieves his ends. He has the gift of conjuring up more things than any ordinary mortal can dream of. His words, his gestures, his glances, even his thoughts and forces are in themselves very powerful. In his own person, he embodies influences before which nature and men, spirits and gods must give way. And apart from a general power over objects, a magician like Prospero has the power over his own being, and this is the prime source of his strength. Though his force of will, through his force of will, he accomplishes things beyond the power of normal human beings. Now, this is another very central point in the Renaissance. As you all know, in the Renaissance, there was this conflict between the baser lusts and urges, the physical urges of man, and the higher spiritual aspirations. And the whole Renaissance is about how to control your baser instincts. And so you see, magic becomes that. That is, your will becomes important. How the will controls things, not only your inside soul, your inside habits, your inside behavior, also the external world. So you see, when you are controlling the external world, you are a magician. But you are also a magician when you are controlling yourself. You are literally taking care that you do not become libidinous or immoral or what have you. So you see, this was a kind of a notion of the inside, outside, if you want, the microscopic and the macroscopic that you find in Renaissance theories, and this relates to Renaissance magic as well. Many of these basic notions and conceptions of magic and magicians continued for over 4 centuries. In the 20th century, the interest in magic surfaced particularly in the genre of fantasy, a type that emerged arguably with the likes of George MacDonald and Charles Kingsley and reached its peak with C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia. Yet, the greatest success in fiction featuring magic was accomplished by a hitherto unknown author, J.K. Rowling, with the Harry Potter tomes. Perhaps for the first time in the history of fiction embodying magic, was the world of wizards and witches sharply demarcated from the world of the Muggles. This is in fact significant, for what we have here is a prioritization of magic over mundane reality. Gringotts, right? The magical currency, Okay, the fact that your parents can leave some money for you in a safe deposit locker. Right? Once again, you see, these are conventional notions which are there in the magical world. And so you see, they are sort of, if you want, pointers or locations by which we can navigate our world through the fantastic world of Harry Potter and his magic. Okay? Anyway, once again, if you think of these things, the cards, the magical cards, okay, Dumbledore's, cards with Dumbledore and the other magicians, right? The good and evil, essentially racist, isn't it? Muggles, mixed bloods, mudbloods, or wizards, okay? 3 classes of people, right? And the pure blood wizards are, of course, Nazis, the Death's Hand and the Death's Head, if you remember. Okay, so this is a kind of a throwback to the notion of, Aryan purity that Hitler would have found very convincing. So you see, these are very interesting interconnections between Harry Potter and the reality world, the real world of ours. Now, yet to say all this is not to detract from the inventive genius of Rowling. Only it may be reflected upon that the giving of priority to magic over the mundaneness of a Muggles universe would perhaps not have been possible in an earlier era. Behind Rowling's giving of importance to the alternity of magic, there lies the drives, the thrusts of feminism, Orientalism, perhaps queer theory, and certainly most essentially of post-structuralism. The whole idea of the other being celebrated. This is something which obviously is something very contemporary. And this is exactly what Harry Potter, or rather Rowling, is doing. But I believe I have said enough about magic in literature. And now it is time to briefly turn to a consideration of matters of deeper import, like the magic of literature. I wish to begin with a commonplace that literature is visionary, the creative expression of a writer's imaginative powers. It is, as Terry Eagleton famously said, and I quote, "Literature is vitally engaged with the living situation of men and women. It is concrete rather than abstract, displays life in all its rich variousness, and rejects barren conceptual inquiry for the feel and taste of what it is to be alive." Unquote. That was Eagleton. Certainly, the greatest works of literature touch our emotions, have the power to move us, and the most affecting texts can propel us to laughter or to tears. Yet, no literature is ever truthful, and even while we are most moved by it, we know and acknowledge that it is but fiction. Our reaction to literature was brilliantly summed up by the English Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who identified that at the core of the readerly experience of literature, there was, quote, "a willing suspension of disbelief," unquote, adding up to a special kind of conviction which he called poetic faith. Coleridge was, of course, not the first critic of literature to have identified the elusive nature of literature and the unique claim it made on the reader's credulity. That literature is a matter of illusion goes back to Plato among the ancients and to John Dryden and Samuel Johnson before Coleridge in England. Dryden had famously described drama as a just and lively image. Notice the word image. And Johnson, in his preface to Shakespeare, had reflected on the nature of stage illusion. My point is that both the magician and the literary creator are evokers and creators of images, of enchantments and delusions, of signs that may be well taken to be realities, at least on one level of perception. Of course, the increasingly rational and scientific temper of Europe from the early modern period altered contemporary perceptions and reactions to low and high densities of semioticity. In medieval liturgical drama, the enactments of biblical narratives on the pageant stage was not merely representations, but a truth guaranteed by Christ, the pure signifier, who was not separated by any trace of difference from the meaning it signified. Conversely, it was believed that all acts of magic were the outcome of the undeniable presence of the devil, and this explains in large measure the witch and wizard hunts of the time. In early modern drama, on the other hand, a gap opened up between the onstage signifier and the originary signified. And I want to quote from an article which is called The Body Semiotic in the Theatre by a man called Attila Caius, and he says, "The protagonists of Jacobean drama, no longer act out the union of flesh and spirit, body and originary meaning. They much rather foreground the inner split that culture and the human being are based upon. The actor on the Renaissance stage never really aims at cheating the spectator into believing that the person on the stage is not an actor, but Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, that the little branch of a tree is not an emblem of the forest and fertility, but an actual wood, or that the trapdoor is not only emblematically, but actually the gate to the castle of Lucifer. The stage here problematizes a basic semiotic issue of culture. What kind of a sign is a human being or any element of reality? The human being, as represented by the Renaissance actor, realizes that it can never coincide with itself, never be present to itself. It no longer carries within its guaranteed meaning. Reality moves from the iconic into the indexical phase when we can only suspect or hope for the causal relationship between creator and the creator, but the direct motivating proofs are lost. The center is dislocated. Order is questioned in the universe, unquote. In other words, this is of course what Donne said. The new philosophy calls all in doubt. Everything is in doubt at the end of the Renaissance. The apotheosis of such hesitancies surfaced in the postmodern era, as works of art increasingly came to represent the arbitrary, eclectic, hybrid, decentered, fluid, discontinuous pastiche-like. Suspecting all truths and certainties, the form of literature itself became ironic and its epistemology relativistic and skeptical. Anti-foundationalist to the core, postmodernism came to realize that we cannot found our activities rationally, not only because there are different discontinuous, perhaps incommensurable rationalities, but because any reason we can advance will always be shaped by some pre-rational context of power, belief, interest, or desire, which can never itself be the subject of rational demonstration. Knowledge, it came to be felt, is only relative to cultural contexts, so that the claim to know the world as it is simply an illusion. Not only because our understanding is always a matter of partial, partisan interpretation, but because the world itself is in no way in particular. Truth came to be regarded as the product of interpretation, hermeneutics. Facts began to be seen as constructs of discourse, subjectivity or objectivity, as just whatever is questionable. Interpretations of things has currently seized power, and the human subject is as much a fiction as the reality he or she contemplates. Now, Eagleton says that behind postmodernism there is a driving agency of Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. And you see, my point is that these perceptions are more in keeping with the theme of this conference, and we may note that in these doubts and dissatisfactions, queries and interrogations, all these led to the rise of magic realism later in the 20th century. But allow me to conclude with one last point. It has been my argument that literature is akin in texture and intention to magic, and that the author of fantasy equally as that of realistic literature serves a function similar to that of the magician. But may I say that the magic realist too is a magical performer with the ability to raise up before our perceptions more realities than ordinary men and women can ever think of. Thank you very much.
Professor Subir Kumar, can I request you on the stage again, please? I would also like to request our Honorable Vice Chancellor on the stage, please. Thank you very much, Professor Subir Kumar, for this magnificent insight of magic in literature. We are very honored to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, and thank you also, Professor Subir.